Before we dive into this episode, you should know that it contains pretty disturbing details about child abuse and incest, so listen with care. But there's also some people who tirelessly fight against this sort of stuff. Have a look at our show notes for numbers for support services if you need them.
It's dawn in rural Waikato, November 2016. Simon Peterson is about to execute a search warrant.
There was a farm down Cambridge Way, a bunch of officers in vests with all the gear, rocking up to your house, knocking on the door.
Inside the rundown house is a suspect Simon and his team have been monitoring for 2 months.
We had an interest in this particular person in this chat room. They were sharing material, so they were committing offending.
And now it's time to confront the man, or as Simon rather delicately puts it,
kind of invading your space for a while to try and establish the offending and find the evidence.
At first, there was some denial from the 47-year-old farm worker.
A lot of people won't admit to this. Some will, but a lot of people won't admit to it. So the work's on us to find the evidence, and that's what we'll do. So we're typically looking for devices that could have been used to offend.
Simon's at the house for 6 hours.
So we found the devices that we were interested in. His phone was one of them, and he had more material already stored, which was enough for us to seize the devices and arrest him as well.
They took him to Hamilton Police Station, where he was processed and interviewed, and soon he was in court.
He pled guilty pretty quickly. He wasn't mucking around.
Guilty of possession of child sexual abuse material. The man was sentenced to home detention, and his name was added to the Child Sex Offenders Register. It was a depressingly routine police operation, with a depressingly routine outcome. But what happened next was far from routine. That morning raid in rural New Zealand set off a chain of events that would drastically change lives in a tiny Arizona town and reverberate all the way to Salt Lake City, Utah.
In an interview with Fox 13,
an investigation by the Associated Press claims an abuse.
They just let it keep happening.
And his two
One of the
daughters,
most horrific crimes anyone could do.
they clearly tolerated the abuse.
I'm Murray Jones, and this is Heaven's Helpline, a 6-part New Zealand Herald investigation into the Mormon Church in Aotearoa and beyond. Episode 4, The Helpline. Simon Peterson is the Chief Customs Officer in the Child Exploitation Operations Team at New Zealand Customs.
Predominantly we deal with the movement of child sexual exploitation material or objectionable publications. So we're looking at people who are trading this material with other people around the world, across our cyber border, we call it.
In late 2016, Simon was a year into his role in the unit.
So I was a new investigator.
But even as a newbie, he'd still seen some horrific things in the dark corners of the internet, or on people's phones, or on their hard drives. You have to develop a pretty thick skin for this work, and good coping mechanisms, including stepping away from your screen.
You don't know when something's going to hit you and it just doesn't feel right. So that's always a possibility, is you'll come across something you can't conceive of and you just need to go and take a break.
After the dawn raid in Cambridge, Simon began the routine process of going through the offender's phone, cataloguing all the files, including still images and videos.
It was a fairly simple process of checking it against what we already knew, marking the ones we don't know.
Simon needs to catalogue the material for the purposes of prosecution. But the thing that he said about separating what we already knew from the ones we don't know, what he's talking about there is something that arises from the disturbing fact that once a child sexual abuse video has been posted somewhere on the internet, it's basically out there forever.
We could have 1,000 staff and still not touch the sides of this. There's that much going on.
No matter how many people might be arrested for possessing it, no matter how many hard drives and phones get seized, there'll always be another copy of it being shared or sold or swapped online, year after year after year. So, law enforcement agencies have developed an international system where each offending computer file is indexed using what's called a hash. Basically, they generate a digital fingerprint of that file. This means investigators like Simon don't have to watch and rewatch every single abuse video on the countless devices they seize. They can instead compare the hash values to that database and go, right, that's one of the ones we already knew about. And that means it's easy to spot if an image or video is new to the internet, because it won't already be on Interpol's database.
So one of those videos, when we put it through our international collaboration, we checked it against the hash databases, it came back as not known. So that's the first red flag, is it's not been, no other law enforcement in the world has indicated that they've seen this by hashing it.
This 9-minute video that was found on the phone of a man in Cambridge in New Zealand hasn't been seen by law enforcement before, so it was probably created relatively recently. And that's really important.
Behind every investigation, though, is a concern for the victims that are shown in material that we're dealing with.
And this video from the Cambridge raid, it contains some strong potential leads.
That video had some good markers in it for victim identification. We could see that. I could tell straight away it was American and that it was probably West Coast American. I won't go into all the details, but accent was pretty clear. And there were a couple of other features that I won't describe that made us think it was probably West Coast America.
So Simon uploaded it to the Interpol system and marked it for investigators in the US.
And said you guys might want to have a look at this.
Simon's upload was acknowledged by the United States National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC. People call it NCMEC.
And then it went quiet, and it always does.
It's incredibly hard to identify and locate children who are being abused in this type of material. In most cases, Simon doesn't hear anything more.
And that's cool. We know we don't need to hear back, but in this particular case, we did.
Early one Friday morning, a couple of months after the Cambridge case referral to Interpol, Simon sat down at his L-shaped desk at the office in central Auckland.
Logged in, fired up the computer, opened up the email. It was sitting in the inbox. It just had a simple message in there saying, great news, we've identified the offender and he's been arrested, and we've subsequently identified and safeguarded the kid as well. I still remember it. Sorry. Had to get up and walk out. It's pretty shaky. Yeah. I don't know why I get emotional about it.
I think it's understandable.
Yeah, I guess it was probably the first case that I'd had that sort of outcome communicated back. That's probably why the response was and still is quite visceral. I've done cases since then and I don't respond the same way. So maybe that's what it is. It was, yeah, quite powerful. Ultimately, that's the point of what we're doing, is to protect kids and get them out of harm's way. Yeah, and it doesn't happen often, so when it happens, it's good.
The kid from the video that Simon helped to save, she'd been living at the end of a dirt road on the outskirts of Bisbee, a small old copper mining town in Arizona, about 18 kilometers north of the Mexican border. Population 5,000. I need to give you another content warning here. The next couple of minutes is pretty graphic and deals with child sexual abuse. This was the Adams household, father Paul, mother Lisa, and 6 children living in a 3-bedroom home surrounded by desert, out of the way of prying eyes. Lisa Adams was in charge of household duties, getting the children off to school and to church on Sunday. Paul Adams worked as a US Border Patrol agent. Legal documents paint a picture of a disordered house littered with piles of clothing. I've seen photos of their house. Up on a shelf, a sign saying family sits below a large picture of Jesus. A wall hanging reads, "Bless this family," as it dangles from a curtain rail. Also around the house were containers of lubricant, which Paul Adams would use when he sexually abused his daughters. He began raping one daughter, referred to as MJ in media reports, from the age of 5, possibly even younger. He started sexually assaulting one of MJ's younger sisters when she was 6 weeks old. When Adams was assaulting MJ, he would make her hold his smartphone to record it on video. He would then upload the videos to internet chat rooms, where he bragged he was living the perfect lifestyle because he could rape his daughters whenever he wanted, and his wife knew and doesn't care. And one of those videos, a 9-minute clip recorded when MJ was 10 years old, it was shared and reshared until about 2 years later it ended up on a Cambridge paedophile's phone that was seized in a raid. Then, US authorities used facial recognition technology to search for the offender, and because Paul Adams was a border guard, a federal employee, he was swiftly ID'd. Agents descended on the border station in Naco, Arizona, and arrested Adams. Under interrogation, he admitted to raping MJ and sexually assaulting her younger sister, and uploading videos of the assaults to the internet. And after raiding the Adams home, agents found 4,000 photos and 1,000 videos of child sex abuse, many featuring his daughters. Paul Adams was arrested and charged, but before his case got any further, he committed suicide. Lisa Adams, the mother, pleaded no contest to child sex abuse charges and served 2.5 years in state prison. 3 of the Adams children went to live with members of Lisa's extended family, while the other 3 were taken in by local families. Unbelievable, unspeakable trauma for these girls, but at least they had been rescued from that house. Rescued by a chain of strangers, by a customs officer on the other side of the world, by officials at NCMEC, by the Homeland Security agents who got a confession out of Paul Adams that day at the US-Mexico border. Which makes the next part of this story all the more astonishing because, and you're probably way ahead of me here, Simon Peterson wasn't the first person outside of the Adams household or a dark web chat room to learn about the abuse. Paul Adams had been a member of the Mormon church, and 2 of his bishops had known about the abuse and never told police. The first bishop learnt about the abuse in 2010. Paul Adams was arrested in 2017. 7 years of lost opportunities to stop a paedophile whose offending was about as extreme and blatant as it's possible to get. Extreme, but there are similarities to what we've already heard from Mormons in Aotearoa. You know the drill. There's abuse, a bishop is told, then nothing much happens. But in 2022, the Associated Press broke a story that contained astonishing new insight into how and why those cover-ups happen. This was the AP story that I heard midway through my own reporting, the one that forced me to reevaluate what I thought I knew about cases like this. The AP story broke 5 years after Paul Adams' arrest and suicide, because when the Adams children got older, 3 of them decided to sue the Mormon church over the bishop's failure to report what they knew.
Lupita Murillo has a shocking story in tonight's News 4 Tucson investigation.
This 24-page civil complaint was just filed in Cochise County against members of a Bisbee church, accusing them of not protecting their youngest members.
And as that lawsuit kicked off, it became obvious that the cover-up of Paul Adams' abuse went way higher up the church hierarchy than just the local bishops. The details get complicated, but boiled right down, here's what happened. MJ was just 5 when her father first confessed to a bishop that he had sexually abused her. This was Bishop Herod. He was a doctor by profession. Lisa Adams was one of his patients. Bishop Herod called the church for advice. He was told that confessions are confidential and that he could be sued if he reported it to the police. So he didn't. Instead, he tried to counsel Paul Adams to repent, to move out of the home, to turn himself in. But Adams continued to rape his daughter. So, Bishop Herod tried another tack. During a counselling session with Adams, he invited Lisa Adams along, in the hope that as the mother, she might be able to protect her children. Did that work? No, it didn't. The rapes continued, and Adams started uploading videos onto the internet. Then, a new bishop took over the ward. This was Bishop Morsey. Before Bishop Herod left, he passed the details of the Adams situation to Bishop Morsey, and Bishop Morsey called the church. Just like Herod, he wanted some guidance on how to handle this nightmare. And just like Herod, he was warned not to contact the police. But he was offered a new suggestion: convene a disciplinary council. You know, like the one Jade faced after admitting to an affair. And this church court did its job. Adams was excommunicated, kicked out of the church. From the church's perspective, the matter was resolved. Well, except for this. Paul Adams kept raping his daughter. And no one told the police. It would be another 4 years, during which time another daughter was born and almost immediately victimised, before Adams was arrested. In a response to the AP story, the church said AP had misrepresented the extent of the abuse that the bishops were aware of. It argued that the first bishop, Herod, was only aware of a single case of abuse from a limited confession from Paul Adams and was not aware if it was ongoing. But when questioned by law enforcement, Herod said he assumed the abuse had stopped and never asked if it picked up again.
They just said, hey, let's excommunicate her father. It didn't stop. Let's have them go to therapy. It didn't stop. Hey, let's forgive and forget, and this will all go away. It didn't go away. They just let it keep happening.
That was MJ speaking to the Associated Press for that 2022 report. By then, she was 16. Her foster parents talked about her remarkable resilience and how she was doing well at school. New Zealand Customs Officer Simon Peterson was interviewed for that AP report as well. It was 5 years since he'd started the chain of events that would save MJ, but it still hit him hard.
It's a mix. It's happy, sad. You're sad because of what's happened. You're sad for the kid, but you're happy as well that this is where they're at now. You know, they go through a lot once an offender's arrested and this situation is ended. That kid has to deal with so much that they shouldn't have to deal with, that most adults don't have to worry about.
Look, after hearing the stories from New Zealand, from people like Caroline and Jade, people like Neville and Jenny, perhaps I shouldn't have been so shocked by the Paul Adams story and the church's failure to report his crimes. But I was. I was dumbfounded, to be honest. Because after hearing the New Zealand stories, I'd been getting the sense that there was a culture, an instinct perhaps, for local church leaders to want to deal with things in-house. And a lot of it seemed to be based on an absolutist view about keeping the family together at all costs. But this case from Arizona, and the really detailed coverage of who told which bishop when and which bishop did what next and exactly what the church advised and how they delivered that advice, it showed that in the American church at least, this wasn't just an instinct or a culture. This was church policy. The church guidelines were that if a bishop was told about sexual abuse within a ward, the first thing they should do was pick up the phone and call a dedicated sexual abuse helpline run by the church itself. A helpline not for victims, but rather for bishops and stake presidents. In the Paul Adams case, when bishops rang that number, they soon found themselves talking to a lawyer, and that lawyer told them not to call the police. The AP story lifted the lid on a systematic, organised process overseen by church lawyers, enabled through this helpline. And the crazy thing is, the church wasn't even breaking the law by giving this advice. After the break, I'll explain how that could even be possible.
I must confess to you.
We need to talk
I must tell someone.
about something called priest-penitent privilege.
I want to make a confession.
It's actually a pretty familiar idea. If you're a Christian and you've done something wrong and you're seeking God's forgiveness, you are technically known as a penitent, someone who repents. And in many Christian denominations, you're encouraged to act on that by finding a priest and making a confession. The interesting bit is that everything a penitent says to a priest in the privacy of the confession is automatically confidential. Which is why there are so many books and movies like that 1950s Hitchcock thriller that you just heard a clip from, where the plot revolves around something like a murderer confessing to a priest and the priest getting tied up in knots about what to do next. In certain countries, this confidentiality between a penitent and their priest is not just a church thing, it's actually part of the law of the land, a legal privilege. And there's your name, priest-penitent privilege. And I'm going to say it so many times in the next 3 minutes that I'm going to call it PPP for short. Now, in jurisdictions where PPP is a thing, a priest, a pastor, a bishop, whatever, cannot be forced in a trial to reveal the contents of a confession they have received from a member of their faith. So, back to Arizona and the awful Paul Adams case. There, it was PPP that the church was leaning on when it advised those 2 Arizona bishops not to report the abuse of MJ. The bishops have said the advice they got was that they risked being personally sued, or the church being sued, if they went to police. But the fact is, the church doesn't just lean on PPP, it also works hard to prop it up. Mormon politicians and lobbyists have fought really hard to preserve priest-penitent privilege. In more than 30 US states, alongside other religious groups, they've successfully pushed back against new laws which would make it easier to report sexual abuse revealed during a confession. To make this extra confusing is the fact that Arizona also has mandatory reporting laws, which means certain people, such as doctors, teachers, and social workers, are actually legally required to pass information about child sex abuse to civil authorities. In other words, if they do not report abuse, they can face criminal prosecution. But the church argues that PPP overrides these reporting obligations. But quite aside from whether that legal advice to the Arizona bishops was right or wrong, the thing that really stuck out for me in that AP story was the way the bishops got that advice.
What the policy of this church is to call what's called a helpline.
The idea of a sexual abuse helpline? It sounds sensible, right? But why is it bishops who get to call it, rather than victims? Why do those bishops end up connecting with church lawyers rather than, trained sexual abuse counsellors? In the church's online manual of guidelines and procedures, they say the helpline is an effective way to inform untrained leaders of their legal obligations, which I guess makes sense, sort of. And in response to the AP story, the church said that the abuse helpline has everything to do with protecting children and has nothing to do with cover-up. It suggests the purpose of the helpline is, in part, to directly report the abuse to authorities, regardless of legal exemptions from reporting requirements, when it is known that a child is in imminent danger. The church claims that the helpline routinely reports cases of child abuse to authorities. But when I spoke to this guy...
My name is Timothy Kosnoff.
He had a pretty different take on the helpline.
I'm a lawyer. I live in Seattle, Washington, although my law practice representing survivors of child sexual abuse is a national practice.
Tim Kosnoff has been handling cases against the church on behalf of victims for nearly 25 years. And midway through our Zoom call, I read him some of the church's official response to the AP investigation. They've said The suggestion that Helpline is used to cover up abuse is completely false. The Church Abuse Helpline has everything to do with protecting children and has nothing to do with cover-up. Outside experts who are aware of the helpline have regularly praised it.
Excuse me, I think I'm going to throw up in my mouth.
Tim has practiced law for 40 years. He was a prosecutor and a defense attorney. Then, at the turn of the century, he set up a firm focusing on representing survivors of child sexual abuse. He's taken on the Catholic Church, the Salvation Army, the Jehovah's Witnesses. But his first case with this new firm?
My very first case involved the Mormon Church, and thus began the journey.
That case blew Kosnoff away.
I mean, the first case I thought was a 1 in a million case because, a church wouldn't deliberately put a child in harm's way, put him in a home with a serial child molester.
That was the story of Franklin Curtis, which we don't have time to go into here. But Curtis was a Mormon church leader who sexually abused children in 7 US states over 18 years, from the 1970s to the 1990s. And after each incident, he was simply moved to a different ward. Kosnoff represented one of those children who was suing the Mormon Church. 25 years and thousands of clients later, Kosnoff realizes Curtis's case wasn't as rare as he'd thought. He's been driven to keep doing these cases by a couple of things.
The predominant emotion which carried me through all those cases was anger. Anger, they say, is a useless emotion, but I actually think it's a pretty useful emotion if it's channeled in the right direction. And for me, it was both anger and an intellectual curiosity, a question that the answer just kept eluding me, which is, why do they do this? Why does the church do this?
It's exactly the question that was in my mind as I heard these New Zealand stories and as I read about the Arizona case. So Tim, take it away. Why did the church in the mid-90s set up a centralised abuse helpline which bishops and other church leaders are told to call before they've talked to anyone else?
They've set up a system that involves their lawyers at the very first communication.
Kosnoff gives a hypothetical example to explain how it might play out.
So there's a bishop in West Virginia, and he's got a child there and is reporting that she's being incested by her stepfather.
The bishop is thinking about calling the police because he knows that the state has mandatory reporting laws.
But instead, he knows, because it's right there in the handbook, right on his desk, call this 1-800 number. So he calls, and it's supposedly, to help the child, but it rings into the offices of Curtin McConkie.
Curtin McConkie. That's the law firm that represents the church, the largest law firm in Utah.
It doesn't go to a social worker or a therapist or somebody qualified. It rings in to the offices of Curtin McConkie, and they've got staff attorneys, and they rotate 24/7. If the office is closed, it goes to one of the cell phone numbers, whether it's 2 a.m. or 9 a.m. or whatever. Some lawyer is going to answer that call. Okay, now what happens? Now you've got a bishop who's an agent of the church legally speaking to his lawyer, a lawyer for the church. Now, everything that's said in that communication is attorney-client privilege.
Another privilege. And this privilege is crucially important for the church.
Because a lawyer can't be compelled to testify about his or her communications with their client.
This immediate looping in of a lawyer, pressing go on attorney-client privilege at the first available opportunity, it's really quite the trick.
That's something that, the Catholic Church doesn't even do that one, or the Jehovah's Witnesses, or any of them.
That attorney-client privilege means it's generally impossible for us to know what is said when a bishop calls the abuse helpline and speaks to a church lawyer. But Kosnoff does have an interesting little window into what probably goes on. Because when the abuse helpline was first set up in 1995, calls didn't go direct to a lawyer. Instead, the 1-800 number would take you to the church's Office of Risk Management. which is kind of interesting, given that other risks managed by the office reportedly include injuries, fires, explosions, chemical spills, and severe weather. So, the original system was that if you were a bishop and rang the helpline, you'd get through to the Office of Risk Management, and a worker would step you through a checklist, a kind of screening questionnaire. If that screening showed the case was serious, the worker would transfer you onto a lawyer, and bam, that attorney-client privilege kicks in. This checklist, Kosnoff got his hands on it during one of his early cases against the church, and it's since been leaked online, so anyone can now see this once secret in-house document. And Kosnoff reckons the checklist is extremely revealing.
That form just made crystal clear what the real purpose of that helpline was and still is.
I've got a copy of the Protocol for Abuse Helpline Calls in front of me. The title is in all caps, Comic Sans. Look, this was the mid-90s, so we can forgive this crime against typography. There's a section at the top for date, caller's name, position, ward, and phone numbers. And there's a list of 6 specific questions, each with 2 little checkboxes at the end. One for yes, one for no.
Question 1. Did the abuse occur on church property? That's a lawyer question. Did the abuse occur during a church-sponsored activity? That's a lawyer question. Those are liability questions. Those are, we could get sued questions.
The remaining 4 questions ask if the alleged abuser used a church position of influence to accomplish the abuse, if they were employed by the church, if they had any record of previous abuse, and whether they were currently a missionary. And above the 6 questions, there's a line saying that if the answer to any of these questions is yes, you must immediately transfer the call to legal counsel. The word immediately is underlined. There's a bunch of other pieces of guidance as well, a bit further down under reporting issues. They're told that the caller, the bishop or whoever it is, should use their first name only with no identifying information. It warns that during the screening process, abuse helpline personnel should, quote, never advise a priesthood leader to report abuse. So those are the lines that really stuck out to me when I was reading the protocol. To be fair, there is also some more sensible sounding advice on there. It asks helpline workers to find out whether the civil authorities have been told about the abuse. And if not, then the bishop should encourage the victim or perpetrator or a third party who knows about the abuse to report it. That is an interesting bit of advice when you think about it. When I first read it, I thought, oh great, so this is a scenario where a bishop might be advising an abuser to dob himself in, or others who know about the abuse to report to authorities. That seems quite responsible advice from the church. But first of all, how many abusers do we really think would take this advice to turn themselves in? Second of all, we know that in cases of abuse, particularly child abuse, it is often only the perpetrator and the victim who are aware of what's going on. So appealing to third parties to report abuse if they know about it will miss a huge proportion of cases. The protocol also says if bishops encourage the perpetrator to report, then they should also recommend that the abuser obtain legal counsel. And that, says Tim Kosnoff, is actually pretty cynical advice, because
if you go to a criminal defense lawyer, he's going to say, no, you're not going to go to the police and give a statement.
So actually, this is just another way to reduce the odds of the police hearing anything at all.
And so they prevent the abuser from implicating himself and thereby implicating the church.
Like I said, this protocol document dates back to an earlier version of the helpline setup. It's reasonable to presume the protocols and the processes for connecting to lawyers won't be identical 30 years on. Reports vary about the current practice of who first answers the call. Senior church officials have testified that callers are initially fielded by church workers, while in other cases, such as the Arizona case, it appears that lawyers directly answer the calls. But Kosnoff says this remarkable secret document still tells you all you need to know about the goals behind the creation of the helpline in the first place.
Take a look at that and you'll see how devious this thing really is, what its real purpose is, which is to protect the church and to kill any possible involvement of the church in criminal or civil proceedings by preventing it from ever coming to the attention of the civil authorities.
Actually, there is one other thing we do know about the current day helpline in the US, which is that records of calls are destroyed at the end of each day. At least, that's what senior church lawyers have said during a recent court case in the US. So, first names only, privileged conversations, destroying documents, confidential courts. It appears that the system the church created is about as far from transparent as it's possible to be. It's really quite difficult to take seriously the church's claim that the helpline is all about protecting victims. So for Kosnoff, the helpline's goal is clear: to keep reports of abuse from reaching civil authorities. But what about the deeper question? Why would the church want to do that? What's the upside of keeping things quiet? Well, let's not overthink this. There are a couple of pretty obvious motives. If an abuse report led to a criminal investigation, or worse still, the conviction of individual church members or leaders, that's pretty embarrassing. So keeping things quiet serves to protect the church's reputation. Then there's civil litigation. If the church is sued by survivors of abuse, and it's in a jurisdiction where the legal setup is friendly to victims, settlements against the church can run into the millions of dollars. So shutting things down is also a way to protect the church's money. Reputation, money. And of course, sometimes you've got to make a trade-off between the two. Spend money to protect reputation. Like when the church offers secret cash payouts and non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, to keep victims quiet and stop them from suing. Because, yep, they do that too. 18 months after the Associated Press reported on the abuse helpline's role in the Paul Adams case in Arizona, they broke another story.
We do begin tonight with claims from a former bishop's daughter accusing her father of sexually abusing her for more than a decade.
Now in her mid-30s, Chelsea Goodrich says the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints tried to pay her $300,000 for her silence.
Remember the Office for Risk Management? Well, in 2017, the head of the Office of Risk Management was a guy called Paul Ritting, and recently AP got their hands on a recording of Paul Ritting talking to a woman called Chelsea Goodrich.
I have authorization up to $300,000, and
Chelsea alleges that when she was 9, she was abused by her father, John, a former Mormon bishop. And that's the sound of Paul Ritting offering Chelsea $300,000 US on the condition that she never use her story as a basis for a lawsuit against the church. The other conditions: keep this document secret and destroy all the recordings Chelsea was making of her meetings with Ritting. In other words, an NDA and a big cash payout to keep quiet. A little bit of money to save a lot of reputation. Oh, and by the way, all the way back when Chelsea's father John made a confession to his bishop, that bishop called the Abuse Helpline. As a result, Chelsea's father was excommunicated, but of course, the church never told police. Then, when Chelsea, as an adult, went to the police herself, the first prosecution against her father fell over because the church discouraged that bishop from giving court testimony about the confession he'd heard and the call he'd made to the helpline. And that's when Paul Ritting flew across the country to meet Chelsea in person and start talking about dollar signs. That's a lot of work at an extremely senior level to keep an abuse case from reaching court. Here's how Tim Kosnoff sees that kind of balancing act.
Money's not the issue. The church doesn't give a damn about, well, it cares about the money, but, a few million here, a few million there. That's just pocket change. They can spend more money than God. What is expensive is the loss of credibility among the faithful.
One last side note here. That guy, the church's risk fixer, Paul Ritting, he was last seen working in New Zealand as the church's head legal counsel for the Pacific office. That's New Zealand, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. After reading that first piece about Paul Adams and then going down the rabbit hole of the abuse helpline, it was impossible for me to keep thinking that the New Zealand cases I knew about were simply the human failings of individual bishops. You know, regrettable outcomes from a conservative church culture that wasn't particularly well informed about sexual abuse. Now, it seemed obvious to me that they were actually part of something much more deliberate. The church isn't just turning a blind eye to child sexual abuse and other crimes within its community. It has a centrally managed, legally watertight system for reacting to these horrific cases. The crimes aren't being viewed as urgent moral tragedies that require intervention and rescue, but as risks that need to be managed. Not risks to the people in its care, but risks to its reputation, risks to the church's bank balance. I'd been thinking the church had been dropping the ball on this, but as Tim Kosnoff puts it, it was starting to look more like
they're dealing with the problem exactly the way they intend to. They are handling these cases knowingly, willfully, intentionally, and in accordance with direction from the highest levels of the church.
Okay, so what about New Zealand? It's not as if Aotearoa has the same setup as the US with its see-you-in-court culture, its mega lawsuits, its mega payouts, right? Well, that's true, but in some important ways, the legal setup here is just the same as in the US. New Zealand law does actually recognise priest-penitent privilege, PPP, that special status that keeps confessions confidential. It's hardly ever been tested in court, but it's there. It was rewritten into the New Zealand statute books as recently as 2006. And of course, we all recognise the confidentiality between a lawyer and their client, what Americans would call attorney-client privilege. So, those are the two key privileges that the LDS Church relies on as it runs the abuse helpline in the United States. Plus, in New Zealand, unlike Arizona and many US states, there are no mandatory reporting laws. If a priest, teacher, or doctor here learns of child abuse, there is no legal duty to report. So, the next obvious question, is there a New Zealand church abuse helpline? Uncovering the helpline in the US was a big deal. There were lawsuits and highly motivated attorneys like Tim Kosnoff and relentless digging by Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalists. So, I was going to have my work cut out for me. I summoned everything I had learnt in my career so far and thought back to my investigative journalism training in London and Googled New Zealand Mormon abuse helpline. And yeah, there it is on the church's website, a 9-digit number with Auckland's 09 area code and the words, "The helpline is available for bishops and stake presidents to call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week." Actually, there are loads of helplines on this page. There are numbers for the US and Canada, a number for the UK, for Ireland, for France, for Australia. But the New Zealand helpline is the one I'm interested in. How often is it used? What kind of calls do they receive? Does the call go straight to a church lawyer? Are details of abuse cases reported back to Salt Lake City, Utah? But most importantly, what advice are bishops and stake presidents receiving? Are they being instructed to keep quiet and to hide behind priest-penitent privilege? So many questions. And who better to answer them than whoever's picking up the calls when a bishop in New Zealand picks up his phone, taps in these 9 digits, and waits for an answer. I guess there's a simple way to find that person. It's time to call the LDS Church Abuse Helpline.
Who am I speaking to?
Next time on Heaven's Helpline.
He's a strange man and his name's Daniel, and I thought, no.
So I went right into my office and I called the hotline and I said, I think I've got something to report.
We sought comment from the church in response to the allegations in this episode. the church did not address the allegations directly, but in a statement said, "As followers of Jesus Christ, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints abhor abuse of any kind. As a church, we invest heavily on prevention and response, and will continue to do so. When a lay leader of one of our congregation learns of abuse, they are asked to immediately call a helpline to assist them to protect the victim and to ensure that perpetrators face the consequences of their actions. Most of the reports of abuse that come to the attention of church leaders come from victims or their families and involve abuse away from church buildings and church activities. Helpline staff offer advice that is focused firstly on protecting and caring for the victim. Working with local church leaders, the helpline ensures compliance with legal reporting obligations, encourages the victim or victim's family to report the abuse to civil authorities, and helps connect victims with professionals who can provide counselling assistance. Heaven's Helpline was funded by New Zealand On Air and the New Zealand Herald for NZME and iHeartRadio. It was researched, written and presented by me, Murray Jones. My producers were Adam Dudding, who co-wrote the series, and Kirsten Johnston from Popsock Media, who edited and sound designed it. Phil Brownlee is our sound engineer. Music was by Thomas Arbour and Anita Clark. News clippings came from Fox News 13 Utah, 12 News NBC, and ABC4 Utah. Audio of Paul Ritting was supplied by Reveal and the Associated Press. Thank you to Mike Resendez and Jason Dorday for your dedicated investigative work on the church. Ethan Sills is executive producer here at New Zealand Herald. If you have a story you'd like to share with me about the LDS Church, or just want to get in touch, email me securely at murrayreports@proton.me or DM me on X at murrayreports. And for more on this podcast, head to nzherald.co.nz/Heaven's Helpline. It's time intensive doing investigations like this. So if you value this kind of journalism, please support it by going to your podcast platform and rating and reviewing the series.